Greetings, everyone. Dr. Kone here with another lecture for you. Now, this week we are focusing on the struggle for equal rights. Truly, this topic can, should, ought to be, could be a whole class of its own. But of course, in this introductory course, we are just doing introductions. Okay. Now, per usual, I will go ahead and put some links to videos that I have prepped for us into the box here on YouTube so that you can open up other boxes while we are in lecture and check out other videos. Okay. I have queued up, prepared up, or just added the links here for some musical selections for you to check out, including songs like Raza, Chicano Park, focusing on Chicano Park in San Diego, and Huelga en General, which is a song from the United Farm Workers. So after this lesson, you should have a better understanding of the meaning of discrimination, the struggle of African Americans, Native Americans, Latinx, and Asian Americans to claim rights denied to them, and women's battle for rights, as well as the fight by other groups in society to claim rights. Once again, there's a lot here in this lecture. We'll get through what we can, and of course I'll post the lecture for you to continue to explore on your own. I think that grounding this debate in things that we can look to recently, the organizing around Black Lives Matter, the organizing around police and state violence experienced by people of color, and the pressure to change the world really, and the experience as we know it in terms of racialized violence and state violence and state oppression. So we're grounded, I think, in recent history. We can just look to the protest of last summer, the Black Lives Matter protest, to look to the mood and temperature of the nation on questions of racial justice. Now, I'd like to begin this with a quote from the organizer from the United Farm Workers, Dolores Huerta, who says, "We must use our lives to make the world a better place, not just to acquire things. That is what we are put on earth for." Right? To really ground us and to think about our own role in this big picture of the world. We think about politics and government and change and social change. We really need to think about what is our position in that, right? And that what is the role that each of us has to play in this, right? And in this planet, in this world, and making it a better place for all. So, if you will recall from last week, the focus of the module last week was on civil rights and civil liberties. Okay? So, where we grounded that discussion, where in civil rights is a place where the government has to do work to assure access to rights, and civil liberties, right? A place where the federal government has to essentially stay out of things for the most part of your life, given the protections that are in the Bill of Rights. Okay. So I've got a link here to this video on the civil rights of Mexican Americans. I'll go ahead and put the link in the text box. But why is this important? Well, it's important to address the civil rights of all Americans. Oftentimes, the conversation on civil rights is often discussed quite literally in questions of black and white. Now, our nation is more than black and white. It's quite complex with a complex history. And I think through that, we need to ground the story of Mexican Americans and Chicanos in this story as well, right? To address things like the segregation that Mexican Americans also experience, to address the racial terrorism and violence, to address the taking of land of Mexican Americans, to think about the role of the Mexican-American War and this idea really of, folks who go from one day being in Mexico to the next day being in the United States, right? Because of the shift in borders, right? To everything, to thinking about the ways in which Mexicans and those with Spanish surnames were not allowed on juries for a long period of time, right? We can talk about racialized segregation in neighborhoods, right? And how that affected Latino and Mexican American communities throughout the nation, okay? So I'd like to pause this and please check out this video here on the civil rights of Mexican Americans. Now, we found this conversation discussion of discrimination and racism. So discrimination, when we think about discrimination, we can think to laws that distinguish between groups of individuals, allowing some to enjoy certain rights while denying those rights to others. Okay. So I've just laid the claim for you that the government is in the business of affirming civil rights, which is true. And the government has also been in the business of discrimination. That's also true. Now, both of these things can be true at the same time. Well, how is that? Well, I say government is in the business of discrimination. We'll just think about the encounters at the so-called founding, right? The early eras of colonization. We've got the Europeans arriving, right? The encounters with indigenous First Nations peoples, the encounters and startings of the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, talk about mix-up of people and culture, and also discrimination that from the beginning privileged, in this country where people already existed, that privileged colonizers and colonizers, the rights of colonizers. It privileged men over women, right? It privileged whites over blacks, Latinos, and indigenous people, right? And most of these things were actually codified by the law, right? It wasn't just, I get to discriminate against you personally or you personally, but rather things that we think of today that were actually legal. For example, the system of slavery was a legalized system of slavery, right? So we can see in that example the ways in which the government has been in the business of discrimination, allowing access to rights for some and not for others. Now, those who've been organizing for justice and rights really, I'm talking about over time, over since the founding of the nation, really have been working to expand access to rights to all people, right? What does that mean? That means you can look to the Bill of Rights. Now, since the Bill of Rights was written, doesn't mean that everybody had access to it or the ability to use it, right? So we're talking about an expansion of rights so that people, other Americans, right, would have access to their rights per the Bill of Rights, okay? Now we can think of racism, okay? Racism is an institutionalized power inequalities in society based on the perception of racial differences, okay? Now, often when we think about racism, we're thinking about like racist encounters or racist events, something that happened that was racist, which is racism, okay? But what often is missed by that is that many people think that racism is a series of encounters between racist people and racialized people. Now, sure, those are examples of racism too, but what we have to understand about racism is the way in which it is a system, right? Where these differences have been institutionalized, right? Made systematic, right? Such that you can have a system-wide response if you are trying to get access to a housing loan, right? The system, if you're a person of color, can tell you no 1,000,000 times no, right? That could be a system where you can go to different banks and you still can't get a loan. You go to different neighborhoods and you can't move into that neighborhood, right? We're talking about whole systems based on racism, and usually codified, right, enshrined by the law to have racist practices, right? So while it's important to recognize racist encounters between people, we also have to address the ways in which systems can be racist. Systems can have policies that are ultimately racist policies, laws, and whatnot.